The fluorescent lights hum in C-sharp above the Oak Creek Memorial Emergency Department, and nobody in Raleigh knows what walks through these doors at 6 in the morning. They see a nurse in blue scrubs, long sleeves buttoned to the wrist despite the July heat, dark hair pulled back so tight it could cut glass. They see someone who doesn't speak during shift change, who moves through corridors like water finding its own path, who corrects ventilator settings without announcing it. They don't see the combat boots beneath the locker, polished to a shine that military transport officers would recognize. They don't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, SEAL Team 3, hidden beneath the scrubs like a secret she buried alive 20 years ago. They don't know her name is Megan O'Brien. And they have no idea what she's about to survive. Megan arrives at Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday morning at 5:38 a.m., before the day's shift noise begins, before the fluorescent lights feel like they're pressing down on your skull. She hangs her jacket in her locker, the one in the back corner, the one nobody uses, and runs her fingers once along the hidden patch without looking at it. The motion takes less than 2 seconds. Muscle memory. She changes into her scrubs, sleeves covering the scars that ladder up both forearms like the history of 23 years she's spent trying to forget. The hospital smells like antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness of air that's been recycled through HVAC systems designed for 300 patients but now running at 470. She knows this place the way a soldier knows a forward operating base, where the exits are, which hallways clear fastest, which supply rooms have secondary doors. Tactical knowledge disguised as familiarity. The night shift report happens in the break room at 6:15 a.m. 23 nurses sitting in a space designed for 8, coffee cups balanced on clipboards, voices moving through the dry clinical recitation of who's critical, who's stable, who might not make it to next Tuesday. Megan sits in the back, takes notes in her own shorthand that nobody else can read, and doesn't speak unless directly addressed. Around her, the other nurses chat about their kids' soccer schedules and which residents are sleeping with which interns and whether the new cafeteria coffee is worse than last year's. Megan drinks hers black. No one sits next to her voluntarily. They've learned not to. At 6:06 a.m., Dr. Harrison Hargrove enters the unit. He moves the way men with unquestioned authority move, white coat crisp enough to flag semaphores, stethoscope draped like a medal of office, the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He's been chief of medicine at Oak Creek for 4 years. Before that, pediatric surgery at Duke. Before that, a fellowship program he led with an iron competence and an iron cruelty that made residents weep in the on-call rooms. He's 52 years old and he's never admitted a mistake. His brother-in-law is a federal judge. His wife's family owns commercial real estate across 3 counties. He has never, in his entire life, encountered a consequence that stuck. Hargrove reviews the overnight census with his attending, 14 acute, 6 ICU, 2 in the trauma bay waiting for surgery. His eyes move across the unit with the precision of a man inspecting territory. And that's when he sees her. Megan, moving from one patient room to another, checking lines, adjusting ventilator settings on an ARDS patient with a kind of quiet efficiency that makes it look invisible. She doesn't announce her movements. She doesn't explain her actions. She simply executes with the practiced certainty of someone who's done this under circumstances where hesitation meant death. Hargrove watches for exactly 4 seconds. Long enough to notice that she doesn't defer. Long enough to understand that she's competent in a way that doesn't require his validation. He doesn't like that. Morning rounds begin at 7:36 a.m. sharp. Hargrove moves through the unit like a general inspecting troops, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, his hands gesturing to charts and monitors, his presence making the air pressure change in whatever room he enters. Behind him trails his attending, 2 residents trying to look engaged, a medical student who should not be here but who was probably promised a publication, and Megan. Always Megan, positioned slightly behind and to the left, silent, watching everything. They stop at room for 47 first. That's where Corporal James Ritter is. Ritter came in yesterday by ambulance, transferred from Walter Reed after his initial stabilization, shrapnel wound sustained in Baghdad during a patrol in the Jolan district that went catastrophically wrong. compound fractures of the left tibia and fibula, pneumothorax that required needle decompression in the field, lacerations across his shoulders and back that will scar in ways that nothing heals from. He's 24 years old. He's conscious but sedated, his mother sitting in the chair beside the bed with the particular exhaustion of someone who hasn't slept since the casualty notification. His father stands at the window, looking out at Raleigh in the early morning, looking like he's calculating distances to somewhere else. Hargrove enters the room with his entourage and begins his assessment. Blood pressure, oxygen saturation, pain levels, surgical closure timeline. His voice is smooth, practiced, designed to reassure families that their son is in the hands of a superior intellect. He moves to the medication chart, makes 3 quick notations, then pauses. His eyes flick across the antibiotic regimen, ciprofloxacin 500 mg for every 12 hours, and without hesitation he writes a modification. Moxifloxacin 400 mg for every 24 hours. The chief of surgery is standing directly beside him. Megan is 2 feet away, reading the monitor. The problem is that Ritter's chart clearly indicates a documented allergy. Not anaphylaxis, a severe photosensitivity reaction from the fluoroquinolone class when combined with his current wound care regimen. A manageable allergy, but an allergy nonetheless. The Cipro is the correct choice. The moxifloxacin is a mistake. A significant one. Megan doesn't look up from the monitor. She doesn't make eye contact. She doesn't raise her hand or clear her throat or perform any of the performative deference that hospitals have trained nurses to execute. She simply steps forward, places her finger on the chart, not on Hargrove's hand, just on the paper, and says 7 words in a voice like still water: documented allergy to fluoroquinolone class, doctor. The room stops. The mother's exhaustion sharpens into attention. The father turns from the window. The medical student's pen freezes. The chief of surgery's eyes narrow in a way that suggests she's seen this before and she's about to watch something die. Megan doesn't remove her finger. She doesn't soften her tone. She doesn't say it again or apologize for saying it or qualify it with anything that suggests she might be wrong. She simply stands there, her arm extended, her eyes on the chart, her presence filling the room like a pressure system. Hargrove's jaw tightens. It's visible. The muscle in his left temple pulses once. His eyes move from the chart to Megan's face, meeting her eyes for the first time, and in that moment something calculated happens behind his expression. She's just corrected him. In front of the chief of surgery. In front of his residents. In front of a family whose son is lying broken on a hospital bed. She's just announced to everyone in this room that Dr. Harrison Hargrove made a mistake. That he missed something. That he's not infallible. He says nothing. That's the most terrifying part. Not anger. Not even indignation. Just a slow smile that doesn't reach his eyes and a voice so controlled it sounds like it's coming through a speaker. Thank you for your vigilance, Senior Chief. Megan blinks. It's barely visible. She removes her hand from the chart. The title is wrong, she's just a nurse, nothing more, nothing special, no rank that matters in a civilian hospital, but something about the way he's said it carries a weight that turns her blood cold. Not because he used a title that's civilian impossible, but because he knew it. He knows something. He knows something about her that he shouldn't know. The moment passes. Hargrove crosses out his notation and writes Cipro instead, his handwriting sharper, more aggressive. He continues rounds without looking at Megan again. The room exhales. The family settles back into their vigil. The chief of surgery makes a mental note. And Megan stands absolutely still, her hands at her sides, her breathing unchanged, her composure intact, while the part of her brain that survived 23 years of combat warfare calculates exactly how much danger she's just walked into. The rest of morning rounds moves through the remaining patients with the mechanical precision of a well-rehearsed ritual. ICU beds filled with the chronically dying, acute care with the acutely salvageable, trauma bay with a motorcycle accident victim who's going to need plastic surgery and physical therapy for the next 5 years. Hargrove makes his assessments, his voice smooth, his manner professional, his attention carefully distributed. He doesn't look at Megan. That's the second most terrifying part, the deliberate absence of attention, the calculated exclusion, the promise embedded in a single glance that what comes next will be carefully orchestrated. By 9:11 a.m., when rounds conclude and the team disperses to their respective duties, Megan is moving through her assigned patients with the efficiency of someone who's practiced crisis triage in actual crisis conditions. She's checking lines, adjusting medications, ensuring that every parameter is optimized for healing. She's competent. She's quiet. She's invisible. She has no idea that Dr. Hargrove is already making phone calls to people owed him favors. She has no idea that he's beginning to architect something that will take careful planning and strategic positioning. She has no idea that in the next 72 hours, her life at Oak Creek Memorial is about to become something between a battlefield and a prison. What she does know is that he said senior chief. What she does know is that his eyes changed when he realized what she was. What she does know is that in a hospital this hierarchical, this careful, this designed to protect men like Hargrove from accountability, she's just made the most dangerous enemy possible, a man with institutional power and something to prove. And she has no idea what's about to happen next. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial started at 7. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 7:15, which meant he controlled the narrative before anyone else had finished their coffee. He moved through the corridors like a man who had never been told no, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his badge clipped to a lanyard that read Chief of Cardiology in letters that seemed to grow larger every time Megan saw them. Room for 47 was where Corporal James Ritter lay recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained in Baghdad 3 weeks prior. His parents had arrived that morning, his mother still in shock, his father wearing the particular exhaustion of a man who had learned helplessness in a desert 20 years ago. Megan had already checked Ritter's vitals at 6:30. O2 sat 94%. Heart rate stable at 72. The pain medication she'd administered, the dosage she had personally verified against his pulmonary function, was working. His breathing was measured. His eyes were clear. She had documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that good nursing meant anticipating what doctors would miss. Dr. Hargrove pushed into the room without knocking, his presence shifting the air pressure like a door opening in a storm. He stood at the foot of Ritter's bed, studying the chart as if reading a verdict. His eyes found Megan the way a compass finds north. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying the weight of rehearsed authority. "Since you seem to enjoy second-guessing physicians, perhaps you'd like to explain to Mr. and Mrs. Ritter why their son's pain medication was delayed due to your incompetence." The room contracted. Mrs. Ritter's hand moved to her husband's shoulder. Corporal Ritter's jaw tightened. Megan had trained herself for this, not in nursing school, but in places where hesitation meant death. Her hands remained steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was calibrated to penetrate noise and chaos without rising above it. "I stand by my clinical judgment, Doctor. The original dosage would have caused respiratory depression given his lung injury." "Is that so?" Hargrove said, moving closer, his height designed to intimidate, his posture a blade. "Or is this another example of the clipboard crusader thinking she knows better than a doctor with 20 years' experience?" One measured breath. Megan's eyes remained locked on his, and something happened in that moment. A single tear traced her cheek, unbidden, the kind of vulnerability that appeared before she could stop it. But she didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it with the back of her hand, her gaze never breaking contact, and spoke in a voice like still water. Like something that had moved through fire and come out the other side calm. "I stand by my clinical judgment, Doctor." Dr. Chen, the resident, looked at his shoes. Mrs. Ritter released her breath like she'd been holding it for years. Hargrove's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something deeper, the rage of a man accustomed to breaking people, watching one refuse to shatter. He turned and left without another word. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to the small war that had just concluded. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial occupied a corner of the third floor where nurses collected their coffee at 6, their lunches at 12, and their fractured conversations at every hour between. It was a room designed for 5 people. 20 worked the floor. On the morning after rounds, Megan sat down with a cup of black coffee and yesterday's crossword puzzle. Within 30 seconds, 5 nurses collected their lunches and left without a word. Dr. Chen glanced at her, looked away, and followed them out. Someone had left a sticky note on the microwave in handwriting Megan didn't recognize. Some people don't know their place. She sat alone for 20 minutes, her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold, staring at the crossword puzzle she'd filled in that morning in her car, a habit from years of waiting, years of being awake before dawn, years of solitude. The puzzle remained unfilled. The coffee remained untouched. The room remained so quiet you could hear the refrigerator's compressor cycling, like a heartbeat counting down to something. That's when Megan understood Hargrove's strategy. It wasn't a frontal assault. It was erosion. It was systematic. It was the kind of precision that came from understanding human nature the way a predator understands prey, that isolation was more effective than argument, that visibility of rejection worked better than quiet cruelty, that watching someone sit alone while the world moved around them was worth more than any direct confrontation. She left the break room without finishing her shift. Her supervisor didn't ask why. Nobody asked anything anymore. 2 days later, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board. The paper was white, the margins precise, the letterhead official. But it was her name that drew attention, written in red marker across the top of the page in letters large enough to read from the nurse's station, M. The Bryan, protocol violation. The write-up cited documentation errors, unauthorized medication adjustments, and what it called a pattern of insubordination toward attending physicians. Every single charge was fabricated. Every citation was wrong. But the form was official. The signature was genuine. And the red marker made sure nobody could walk past without seeing it. Megan read it once. Her face remained still as stone, no flush, no trembling, no sign of the gravity of what she understood immediately. This was stage 3. This was institutional weaponization. This was a man using the machinery of medicine itself against her, and she was standing in a hallway watching it happen. She walked to her locker without a word. Nobody spoke to her. The young resident who had witnessed the morning rounds glanced at her, then back at the write-up, and Megan saw the calculation happening in real time, the cost-benefit analysis of association. She saw the moment he decided she wasn't worth it. That evening, she sat in her car in the parking lot, her hand shaking as she turned the ignition. Rain had started falling in Raleigh, the kind that came in sheets, hammering against the windshield. She drove to Oakwood Cemetery because that was where David was buried, and she needed to tell him something, though she didn't know what until she was already there. The grave was on a hillside that sloped toward a stand of oak trees, their branches bent under the weight of water. Her hand pressed against the cold headstone, rain soaking through her scrubs, and the words came out as a whisper that the rain carried away. "I thought I could disappear here," she said. "I thought I could just be normal. Just be a regular nurse, raise flowers, forget the sand and the blood and the screaming. But I can't even do this right. I failed you. I failed them. I failed again." She stayed for an hour. The rain didn't stop. Back at her apartment, she peeled off the wet scrubs and hung them to dry. Only then did she reach into the pocket of her jacket, the one she wore over everything, the one that had traveled further than she had ever intended to go. Her fingers found the familiar shape of what she'd kept there for 20 years, a faded unit patch, no larger than a postage stamp, sewn carefully into the jacket's lining with stitches so precise they were almost invisible. The patch bore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Group 3, Fallujah Detachment. It was the only piece of her past she allowed herself to keep. Everything else had been buried. She held it for a moment, then tucked it back into the lining, securing it against her skin like a secret that wouldn't stay buried. At Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Hargrove made 3 phone calls from his office after the night shift began. The first was to a board member named Sterling, a man who had benefited from Hargrove's recommendations for research grants and consulting contracts. The second was to the registrar at Duke University's nursing program, where Megan had received her degree, with vague mentions of concerning patterns of judgment and requests for her original performance evaluations. The third was to an outside risk management consultant he'd used before, a man who specialized in documentation and termination protocols. He opened a new file on his computer. The folder was labeled O'Brien, Personnel Action. He smiled then, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had learned that institutional power was sharper than any blade. He didn't know what was already in motion. He didn't know that Corporal Ritter was sitting in his hospital bed that night, scrolling through his phone, looking at photographs from 20 years ago, photographs of a woman's face he couldn't quite place, a voice he'd heard in dreams for 2 decades without understanding why. The shift started like every other shift, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song, the antiseptic smell of bleach cutting through the morning air, the steady beep of monitors down the corridor at Oak Creek Memorial. Megan arrived at 5:08 a.m., 20 minutes early as always, her scrubs crisp, her badge clipped precisely to her collar. The unit was still quiet, most patients asleep, most staff not yet wandering in with their coffee cups and their small talk and their practiced avoidance of her presence. She stopped at room for 47 to check the monitors. Corporal James Ritter was already awake. Sitting up. Talking. His voice carried down the hallway, animated, stronger than it had been 3 days ago, the cadence of someone whose body was finally catching up with his mind. She could hear him before she reached the doorway, describing something to the night nurse who was finishing her charts, his hands moving through the air in the vocabulary of soldiers who had learned to speak in gestures and compass bearings. That's when Martinez went down, Ritter was saying, his eyes bright with the particular clarity that came from reliving a moment that had nearly killed you. We were pinned in the Jolan. 3 blocks of houses, maybe 400 meters of open ground. The sniper was in the water tower, we didn't know that yet. Still don't know which building, but Martinez took it through the shoulder. Went down hard. Megan stepped into the doorway. The night nurse nodded and moved past her, grateful for the transition, grateful to be done with his story. Megan's hands were steady as she moved to the monitors, checked the 4-line, scanned the vitals, blood pressure 124/78, heart rate 68, oxygen saturation 96%. All good. All normal. All the things she had been trained to read in 17 years of medical care. But Ritter was watching her now, his eyes tracking her movements with the focus of someone who had learned to notice everything. "You're interested in Iraq?" he asked. Not a question, really. An observation. A test. "I read the reports," Megan said carefully. Her voice was level, the careful neutral tone she had perfected across decades of never revealing a single crack. "Combat medicine is part of the job training." "Baghdad," Ritter said. He pulled out his phone, the screen bright against the pre-dawn darkness of his room. "You ever see what a day looks like when you're getting mortared every 4 hours? I've got pictures from the year I was embedded with Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. They're not pretty, but they're real." He scrolled through his phone, the muscle memory of a man who had organized his service into digital archives, a way of making sense of chaos, of containing it into neat little collections that wouldn't bleed into civilian life. Megan watched the screen as he angled it toward her. Photographs of buildings with rubble spilling from their windows. Photographs of Marines in body armor, faces covered in dust, eyes that had seen things that couldn't be unseen. Photographs of smoke rising in the distance like something alive and hungry. And then, a photograph that stopped her breathing. A street. Fallujah. Jolan District. Not Baghdad, a detail that mattered because it meant something, meant he had been telling the truth when he spoke in his sleep 2 nights ago about the firefight before the IED, before the shrapnel, before he woke up in a hospital bed not knowing who had pulled him out of the vehicle. A burning vehicle. A vehicle that was. "This one," Ritter said, his finger tapping the screen. This was the day everything went wrong. November 2004. We were running a patrol, just routine, supposed to be a 1-hour sweep. Then the world exploded. Megan's hands began to shake. She pressed them against her legs, a motion Ritter would interpret as professional concern, as interest, as nothing more than a nurse responding to a patient's trauma narrative. But her hands were shaking because she could see the vehicle in the photograph. She could see the angle of the sunlight. She could see the smoke. She could see herself in that photograph, a woman in navy blues, her face obscured by the angle, her hands visible in the foreground, reaching for a child who wasn't a child anymore. A child who was now a Marine sitting in a hospital bed, his lung healing, his memories fragmented, his voice describing the day that should have killed him, the day that would have killed him if she hadn't been 3 blocks away when the radio chatter exploded into something beyond protocol. Do you know what the crazy part is? Ritter was still talking. His voice had that quality of reverence that soldiers used when they spoke about impossible things that had somehow happened anyway. I don't remember much of it. The vehicle flipped. I remember that, the world going sideways, my head hitting something hard, pain everywhere. But then there's this gap. Like someone spliced out a section of film. I remember voices. A woman's voice. Giving orders. Telling people to move. Telling me to breathe. And then, nothing until I woke up in the cash unit. Combat Support Hospital. A place where miracles happened on accident, where medics worked with hands that had learned to rebuild bodies from wreckage. Where a senior chief petty officer named Megan O'Brien had stood over a child who was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds and made a choice, stay with the unit or carry the boy to the medevac, risk court-martial charges for abandoning post or watch a child die while she followed protocol. She had carried the boy. She had never told anyone. The official reports listed him as recovered by Charlie Company personnel. The Marines had protected that secret the way Marines protected their own, and she had spent 20 years not allowing herself to think about what happened to him, who he had become, whether he had survived the infection that nearly took him in the days after extraction. I've been thinking about that voice, Ritter continued, scrolling through more photographs, his tone shifting into something that sounded like confession. For 20 years, I've had these dreams where I can hear it perfectly, but I can never see the face. It's like muscle memory in my ears. My therapist says it's probably combat hallucination, post-traumatic stress creating false memories. But it doesn't feel false. It feels like the most real thing that ever happened to me. Megan looked at his hands. The 4-line running into the vein at his wrist. The calluses of someone who had carried weapons across deserts. The slight tremor, not fear, she recognized it, the tremor of someone whose body was rebuilding itself, whose nervous system was learning again how to function in a world where mortars weren't falling. She had not trembled. She had learned not to tremble. She had learned to stand inside her own collapse and keep moving forward with the precision of someone following a surgical protocol. Did they ever tell you who pulled you out? She asked. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, like it was coming from a speaker system in a different room. No, Ritter said. He was watching her now with the focus of a young soldier who had learned to read officers, to understand when someone knew something that they weren't saying. Official records are classified. Or lost. Or both. Military loves to lose things. He paused. But you already know that. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. The way soldiers recognized each other across distance and years, not by uniforms, but by something else, something that lived in the set of the shoulders, the particular silence that came from having survived things that civilians couldn't imagine. Megan made a choice. She looked at the monitor. She noted the time, 6:03 a.m. She documented the vitals in the system with her usual precise efficiency. She was a nurse. She was a civilian. She was someone who had learned to disappear into the job so completely that no one, not even this young Marine whose life she had held in her hands, could see what she actually was. Your physical therapy is scheduled for 8 a.m., she said, returning to the professional distance that had kept her alive for 2 decades. Dr. Harrison will be leading the session today. He's good. Former Army. He'll know what you're capable of. How do you know his former Army? Ritter asked, his eyes still locked on hers. I read people, Megan said simply. It's part of the job. But that wasn't what she was reading. She was reading the photograph still glowing on his phone screen. She was reading the timestamp, 2004. She was reading the mathematics of survival, the probability calculations that should have resulted in a grave marker, not a conscious man asking questions about a voice that had lived in his dreams for 20 years. She stepped back from the bed. The fluorescent light above his head hummed with its monotonous frequency, and she could hear it now, could hear the way it sounded, almost like the rotor wash of a helicopter descending, almost like the sound of a child's breathing returning after you'd convinced yourself that breathing was over. "I'll check on you after breakfast," she said. She left the room before he could ask another question, before her composure could crack into something he would recognize, before the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, the one she had worn every day for 20 years, the one that had her call sign embroidered in letters so small no civilian would ever see them, could somehow become visible through her skin. The hallway stretched in front of her, 20 meters of neutral tile and dim morning light. Her hands were steady now. She had locked everything down, compartmentalized it the way she had learned in field medicine, the way she had learned in the Navy, the way she had learned in a burnt-out vehicle in Fallujah when she chose to be something other than invisible. She was a nurse. She was no one. She had given up being a hero 20 years ago, had traded her rank for anonymity, her service for silence. But somewhere in room 447, a Marine was holding a photograph of the day he should have died, searching for a woman's face he couldn't remember, a voice that had saved him twice, once from fire and shrapnel, and once, apparently, from the forgetting that was supposed to be merciful. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was scheduled for 8 a.m., when Corporal Ritter would stand on the parallel bars in physical therapy, when his recovering lung would collapse under the pressure of his own determination, when his face would turn blue, when his hands would claw at air that suddenly had no oxygen, when everything she had protected him from for 2 decades would come roaring back in a matter of seconds, demanding a choice she couldn't refuse and couldn't survive. The worst part was waiting 12 hours away, hidden in schedules and protocols, in the gap between what she could control and what she couldn't. The parallel bars gleamed under the physical therapy lights, and Corporal James Ritter stood between them like a man determined to reclaim something the shrapnel had stolen. 8:47 in the morning. Megan was 3 floors up, restocking the crash cart on the 4th floor ICU, when the call came through the intercom. Not a code. Not a page. Just the physical therapist's voice, tight and thin, asking for any nurse in the building. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, muscle memory that knew danger the way other people knew their own heartbeat. She took the stairs. 2 at a time. 11 steps down. For seconds flat. The PT suite was small, sterile, the kind of room where people relearned how to walk. Ritter was on the parallel bars, his grip white-knuckled, and his chest was rigid. Not breathing. His face was deepening from pink to purple like someone had turned off a valve inside his lungs. The therapist, a woman named Claire who was competent with exercises but not with emergencies, stood frozen 3 feet away, her hands open, her mouth moving around words that weren't coming. Megan didn't pause at the doorway. She moved into the room the way water finds a channel, her body already knowing what her civilian mind was still catching up to. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung from his Baghdad wounds had ruptured under the pressure of his own determination to stand, and now the air was compressing his heart, choking off his breath, draining the color from his face second by second. He had maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. She had read the chart 3 days ago. Knew his surgical history the way a sniper knows wind patterns, completely, intuitively, without conscious thought. "Step back," she said to Claire. The therapist moved. It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken in a voice like still water, which was the only tone that made people obey without understanding why. Megan's hands were already moving. The crash cart was 6 feet away. She didn't run to it. She walked. Steady. Controlled. Someone who had done this before. Someone who had done this while mortars fell and blood painted the walls of a trauma tent in Fallujah. The 14-gauge needle was where it always was. Her fingers found it without looking. She turned back to Corporal Ritter, and for the first time in 20 years, she let him see her hands, steady as surgical steel, absent of tremor, absent of doubt. "This is going to feel like a punch," she said. She didn't ask permission. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical geography of his right chest that she had memorized from his medical record the moment he arrived. The needle went in with a surgeon's precision, not fast, not hesitant, but inevitable. The angle was perfect. The depth was perfect. Everything in her body remembered what her civilian life had tried to bury. The hiss came. Air escaping. Pressure venting. Oxygen suddenly available. Ritter gasped like a man who had forgotten what breathing felt like, and the purple drained from his face in seconds. Pink returned. Then normal. His lungs expanded, and the monitor behind him beeped back into rhythm, not fast, not erratic, but steady. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Alive. The code team arrived 43 seconds later, but the code was already over. Megan was standing 6 feet away from Corporal Ritter, the needle still in her hand, her face composed as stone, watching him breathe like she hadn't just crossed the line between nurse and something else entirely. "What happened?" the code team leader asked, moving toward Ritter with the brisk efficiency of someone trained in crisis. She was young, efficient, and she was asking the question to the physical therapist, who was still frozen. "Tension pneumothorax," Megan said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still the quiet voice of a nurse. "Right side." She performed a needle decompression before we arrived. She was referring to herself in third person, and no one noticed. They were looking at Ritter's chest, at his rising and falling lungs, at the impossible fact that he was alive. That was when Dr. Hargrove walked through the double doors. He moved with the confidence of a man who owned the space, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, his eyes already scanning for the chaos that would justify his authority. He saw Megan standing apart, saw the code team bending over Ritter, saw the needle on the cart, and something flickered across his face, not confusion, not yet. Recognition. Calculation. Fury, cold and precise, like a knife drawn from ice. "Who authorized the decompression?" His voice was quiet. That was the dangerous part. Not the volume, but the control. The way it cut through the room like a scalpel finding a nerve. No one answered. The code team leader looked at Megan. Megan looked at the monitor. The screen beeped steadily, the rhythm of a man saved, the rhythm of a decision made without protocol, without hierarchy, without asking permission from the man who believed he owned every breath drawn in his hospital. "I did," Megan said. She turned to face him. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were still. Corporal Ritter was in cardiac arrest. "I performed a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. His oxygen saturation is now 96%. His heart rate is 84. He's breathing." Hargrove stepped closer. His jaw clenched. "You violated protocol." He was dying. "You violated my authority." He was dying, she repeated, and there was something in the repetition that was not defensive. It was factual. It was final. It was the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has made life-and-death decisions under enemy fire, not in climate-controlled hospitals, and who understands that protocols matter until they don't, and that the moment when they don't is the moment when people stop breathing. Hargrove's hands balled into fists. He turned away from her, faced the code team leader, his voice dropping to a register that was far more dangerous than shouting. "Get a chest tube in him. Get imaging. And get her," he pointed at Megan without turning around. "Get her out of my hospital. She's suspended, effective immediately. I want her badge, her access, and her name off every roster by end of shift. You hear me? By end of shift." The code team leader flinched. No one moved. Megan stood very still, watching Hargrove's back, understanding exactly what had happened. He wasn't firing her because she had violated protocol. He was firing her because she had saved a life in front of 5 witnesses without his permission, without his guidance, without his name attached to the success. She had made him invisible in his own hospital, and that was a sin he could not forgive. She set the needle down on the cart. turned, walked toward the door with the same measured pace she had used to approach Ritter minutes before. Claire, the physical therapist, was still standing frozen by the parallel bars, and Megan met her eyes as she passed. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects drowning in white noise, and the sound followed her into the hallway, into the elevator, down 4 flights to the ground floor where her car was parked in the staff lot, where she would sit for an hour without moving, where the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining would feel heavy as a gravestone, where she would wonder if invisible people could become visible by being erased entirely. The 48 hours that followed moved with the precision of a surgical incision. Dr. Hargrove convened an emergency board meeting at 6 the next morning in a conference room on the administrative floor, 3 stories above where Megan worked. 3 board members arrived before dawn, each one with a history, each one owing him something. A deferred malpractice settlement. A daughter who'd gotten into medical school through a letter of recommendation only Hargrove could have written. A construction contract that needed zoning board approval from someone who owed Hargrove a favor. These weren't accidents. These were investments. He presented the case like a prosecution. Projected the video of Megan performing the needle decompression on a screen. Walked them through the hospital protocol that required physician authorization for any invasive procedure. His voice carried the practice certainty of a man who'd never lost an argument in his life. She acted without consent, he said. Without notification. Without regard for chain of command. This is a liability exposure of catastrophic proportions. The board members nodded. They understood the language of protection, protecting the hospital, protecting themselves, protecting the institution that kept them relevant. By 6:45, they'd agreed to recommend immediate suspension pending a formal investigation. But that wasn't the worst part. That same morning, while Megan arrived for her shift unaware, Hargrove made phone calls to 3 people whose names appeared in her nursing school file. A professor who'd written her a reference letter in 2003. An instructor from her clinical rotation. The Dean of Student Affairs. His approach was surgical in its precision. He didn't accuse. He insinuated. "I'm just concerned about some behavioral patterns I've observed," he said to each of them. Nothing concrete. Just inconsistencies. Moments where her judgment seemed questionable under pressure. "I wondered if you'd noticed anything during her training that might illuminate her fitness for critical care." The words hung in the air like poison gas, invisible, colorless, but deadly. None of them remembered a single behavioral issue. But now they were being asked to forget that they didn't remember. The seed of doubt is more powerful than evidence. By the time he finished the 3rd call, the narrative had shifted. She wasn't a decorated Navy medic anymore. She was a question mark. A potential liability. A problem that hadn't been properly documented the first time around. He'd also hired a risk management consultant on retainer. Brought her in that afternoon at 2 o'clock, a woman named Patricia Valdez who'd spent 15 years documenting policy violations for hospitals preparing termination cases. She was good at what she did. She arrived with a tablet and a list of every interaction between Megan and Hargrove dating back 3 years. The condescending corrections. The public criticisms. All of it was here, catalogued and annotated. Hargrove explained the medication error incident, the isolation in the break room, the fabricated write-up. But to Valdez, these weren't acts of sustained psychological abuse. They were evidence of a pattern of insubordination. "She challenged your authority repeatedly," Valdez said, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism of someone trained to see everything as data. "She performed procedures outside her scope. She created conflict with senior staff. The needle decompression was the breaking point, but the foundation was already unstable." Hargrove smiled. He was good at this game too, the part where cruelty became process, where sabotage became procedure. By 5 p.m., Valdez had prepared a preliminary report recommending immediate suspension with cause. It wasn't finished. It wasn't thorough. But it didn't need to be. It only needed to exist. Security came for Megan at 6:55 a.m. on the 2nd day. She was hanging her jacket in her locker when two uniformed officers appeared in the break room. Everyone stopped. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were drowning. The coffee maker gurgled mid-brew. And then one of the officers said her name. Megan O'Brien? She turned. Her hands were steady. Her face was neutral. Yes. We need to collect your badge and access card. You're being placed on immediate suspension, effective now, pending an investigation into protocol violations and unauthorized medical procedures. The words came from a script, but Megan heard every single one. She heard the other nurses pretending not to watch. She heard the soft intake of breath from someone who'd trained with her. She heard the silence that meant they were already choosing sides. She reached up and unclipped her badge. For years of shifts. For years of correcting doctors' mistakes in the hallway so they wouldn't catch them on the floor. For years of holding patients' hands at 3 a.m. when the night made everything worse. She placed it in the officer's palm without a word. He scanned her access card with a small device. "Card disabled," he said. "You'll need to exit through the main lobby. Don't approach the patient care areas." The walk to the elevator took 47 seconds. She counted them. 1 foot in front of the other. Shoulders level. Eyes forward. The other nurses didn't say anything. Some looked away. One, Jennifer, who'd worked the trauma rotation with her, started to say something, but Megan simply shook her head once, a movement so small only Jennifer would see it. The message was clear: don't make this harder than it already is. The parking lot was silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Route 64. Her car sat in the same spot where she'd left it. She unlocked the door and sat in the driver's seat for a long time without turning the key. Rain began to fall around 8 a.m., not the gentle kind, but the kind that hammers asphalt like judgment. She started the engine and drove without a destination, just the need to move. Eventually she found herself at Oakwood Cemetery on the western edge of Raleigh, where the ground was wet and the stone markers gleamed with trapped water. David's grave was in the third section, beneath a magnolia tree that had started losing its leaves. She parked and walked to it, her scrub soaked through in seconds. The headstone was cold, colder than anything should be. She pressed her hand against it, the way she had 100 times before, and the rain fell harder. Her voice came out as a whisper at first, then stronger. "I thought I could disappear, David. I thought I could just be normal. I thought if I took off the uniform and put on scrubs and kept my head down, maybe the weight would get lighter." The rain ran down her face. She didn't wipe it away. "But I failed again. I was supposed to stay invisible. I was supposed to heal people without remembering what I'd seen. I was supposed to be someone else." She pressed her forehead against the stone. "I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know who I am without the gun or the team or the mission. And now even that's being taken from me. Now I'm just a woman standing in the rain at her dead husband's grave, and nobody's coming to help because nobody knows I was ever worth saving in the first place." The rain continued. The world was very small and very quiet. But that quietness lasted exactly 3 seconds before everything changed. A car pulled into the cemetery entrance, official-looking, with government plates. Then another. And another. Black SUVs moving with purpose. Megan stood, water streaming from her jacket, and watched as they parked at the cemetery entrance. 4 figures emerged from the first vehicle dressed in dress marine uniforms, their uniforms so sharply pressed they looked like they were made of iron. Behind them stepped a Navy captain, her uniform adorned with medals that caught even the gray light of the storm. The captain looked at the cemetery groundskeeper near the entrance, showed him something, a photo, maybe, and then all 5 of them began walking toward the magnolia tree. Toward the grave. Toward Megan, who was standing absolutely still, water running down her face, her faded scrubs clinging to skin that had once worn camouflage. The captain was speaking into her radio as they approached. "Angel 6, I have visual confirmation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, approximately 30 meters from target location." A pause. Radio static crackled. Copy that. We are prepared to retrieve. Megan's hands had started to shake. Not from fear. From something else entirely. Something she didn't have a name for yet. The Marine stopped 10 feet away and the captain approached alone, water streaming down her cover, her movements controlled and certain. She looked at Megan for a long moment. Then she saluted. "Senior Chief," she said. "I have orders to inform you that your recall to active duty has been authorized under executive order." The captain's eyes met Megan's. Welcome home. If you found this story powerful, hit that subscribe button because there are more like this waiting for you. What would you have done in Megan's position? Should she have stayed hidden, or was her military instinct the only thing that could save that Marine's life? Let me know in the comments. And if you think Dr. Hargrove got what he deserved, or if you think his punishment was too soft, I want to hear from you. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Subscribe now.